It gives me great pleasure to welcome my esteemed colleague, Dr. Johan Wewainer, the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies and Fellow of Wolfson College at Oxford University. Before joining Oxford in 2017, he taught at the University of Toronto, Stanford University, and Harvard, where he received his PhD in Iranian and Persian studies in 2007. I first met Dr. Wewainer as a young graduate student entering the program of Iranian studies at Harvard while I was finishing my PhD at the same institution. We were trained both by the same master, the still legendary Agha Khan Professor of Iranian Prose Dr. Shervo, together with my friend and colleague, the late and regretted Prince Ali Reza Pahlavi. I belong to the first generation of Shervo students, and Johan to the next of the blissful ones. The bonds, academic and personnel, forged in that crucible of fire under the scrutiny of a generous and ingenious but exacting master have been lasting and true, and we still occasionally wonder how much our procedere and approaches do resemble. Octor is online, so we can salute him. Hi, Octor. I have obviously ever since followed very closely his brilliant scholarship and career, and I shall briefly introduce them as we go along. Dr. Wewainer's work is exceedingly meticulous, highly creative, and always brilliant. The principal axis of his scholarship concern the history of Zoroastrianism as an ancient and late antique religion and the literary and exegetical traditions that pertain to it. That is both the Avestan scriptures and the Middle Persian Zoroastrian literature, the so-called Pahlavi literature. In particular, he has been seeking to develop new hermeneutical approaches and tools to apprehend the immense theological and literary activity and creativity of late antique Zoroastrian priests and hermeneutes in conversing with their own arcane religious traditions. A point we shall address in a moment. His philological expertise covers other Iranian languages, be they Old or Middle Iranian corpora, as well as including Old Persian cuneiform, as well as Sasanian epigraphy. He's the co-editor, together with Michael Stausberg, of the Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism, which is an essential reference book for all interested in the history of Zoroastrianism in the so-called longue durée. His manifold, always insightful, and often monograph-long articles are gems of creativity, uncompromising scholarship, meticulous research, and style, for the elegance of which he is often praised and the impenetrability of which occasionally blamed, mostly by me. His two massive tomes that are the subject of his book presentation today, that is the Zoroastrian Hermeneutics in Late Antiquity, the Sūdgar Nask of Dēnkard, Book 9, Text, Translation, and Critical Apparatus, and its accompanying second volume that constitutes a commentary published with Harasovitz Verlag in 2024, represent a new and exciting departure in the study of late antique Zoroastrian hermeneutics. The Sūdgar Nask of Dēnkard, Book 9, is a commentary in Pahlavi, that is, in the Middle Persian language of Zoroastrian scriptures, composed between the 3rd and the 9th century of the Common Era. On the oldest part of the Avesta, produced some 2 millennia before the Pahlavi text, in the 2nd millennium BCE. What Dr. Wewainer undertakes in these phenomenal tomes is nothing less than breathtaking. That is, the elucidation of the interpretative strategies of Sasanian scholars by approaching millennia-old Zoroastrian compositions that, in spite of their age, still represented living traditions to the priestly community of Sasanian Iran. To give an idea of the daunting challenge taken up by Dr. Wewainer in using some Gadamerian language he likes so much, in order to understand the interpretative strategies of hermeneutics of the Sasanian scholars, the modern historian has to discern their intellectual milieu in their own time, which we may qualify as the late antique horizon, while making allowance for the historian's strictures and limitations emanating from his own time, that is, our present time. What makes the task even more formidable is that while attempting to apprehend the intellectual context of Sasanian scholars by dint of their commentaries, we do so through the interpretation of yet another layer of text, which predates them by another 2 millennia and forms yet another horizon, the Old Avestan horizon. Hence, the real object by which the interpretive mechanisms of the Sasanian sages is measured is twice remote from us. Needless to say, these extraordinary obstacles notwithstanding, Dr. Weweiner provide us with a brilliant interpretation of Sasanian hermeneutics and afford us a glimpse into the mechanism of textual interpretation in the late antique Iran. In a gist, the Sasanian scholars use their commentaries of the Old Avesta to actualize its projected content, to read into it the entire socio-theological tenets of the own late antique world, hence enabling the Old Avesta, or their commentary thereof, to remain of import to the Sasanian hermeneut's own evolving times, and be still reckoned as the ultimate source of knowledge. Just a brief note on his future ventures before giving him the floor. Dr. Weweiner is currently preparing a manuscript entitled Topographies of Rhetoric and Moral Reasoning in Sasanian and Post-Sasanian Zoroastrianism. That is going to be probably as unreadable. That is based on the 4 lectures delivered at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris in spring 2024, to be published with Repulse, correct? In addition, he is also working on a co-authored critical edition of the Epistles of Manucher with Arash Zaini, to be published with Edinburgh University Press. I have just one piece of advice to impart on him after the publication of these monumental tomes. He should only eat popcorn and watch Netflix. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Weweiner. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for coming, and Rahim, for such a generous introduction. I have to say it's a bit strange to sort of be here, because it's a bit coming full circle, and I'll explain that in a second. So let's get going with this. So when we talk about the project, really we're talking about a 2-part thing. We're talking about a critical edition, and we're talking about a commentary. Nothing very dramatic in that sense. But what I've tried to do with the material is to be thoughtful about every aspect of how we produce the knowledge that we have. And I think that's something that has taken a lot of time, to be fair. So when we've been looking, what we see here, in a sense, is just the output of all the years of work that went into it. So as Rahim very rightly says, I got my PhD in 2007, and it's taken quite a long time to deliver this. And it's a strange aspect to think about a project that has essentially been something I've worked on my entire career in the academic sense. What I'll try and do today in the talk is just give you a little bit of a window into the various parts of the project and the things that I think are could be quite interesting for people of a varied audience. And in so doing, it'll also discuss the teleology of the project. So let's just begin with a basic question. What is the Dēnkard? So the Dēnkard is the largest surviving Pahlavi text that we have. It's around 169,000 words. So just for perspective, that's, say, 10 times smaller than the Babylonian Talmud. And the first 2 books are lost. It's an interesting aspect of the project that the first 2 books do not exist, and there's not a single line anywhere in Pahlavi that ever says what they were about. It's as if they never existed in that way. People have tried to reconstruct what that means. I will not do that. We have 2 editors, and it is worth saying that We know that they lived, sort of roughly speaking, in the 9th and early 10th century. And our earliest colophon, for the B manuscript, is dated to 1020 CE. This is the earliest colophon we have in Pahlavi literature. So put this in perspective, this colophon represents 10 years, a decade after Ferdowsi died, just to give it a little bit of a context in terms of classical Persian, let's say. And the colophon is quite long and rather difficult, but I have made a stab at it and I have translated it in the work. And it's quite interesting that I see that people cite parts of the colophon and some of the texts that describe the Dēnkard in the Dēnkard more than they do the actual content of the material, because it takes a while to get into that. So we have, in a sense, 7 books. Book 3 is essentially a philosophical work, an apologetic, and it has very much the direct engagement with its Islamic milieu. Book 4 is sort of a history of the transmission of the Avesta and the Zand. Book 5 is a sort of responsa literature that has a Zoroastrian priest responding to 2 non-Zoroastrians, Yaqubi Khalidan and Bukht-Mare. Book 6 is your classic Persian sort of genre, and that is a wisdom literature. Book 7 is a Pahlavi retelling of the hagiography, if you will, of Zarathustra, with a lot of archaic material. Book 8 is more complicated. It's something akin to a table of contents of what survived in late antiquity for Avestan and Pahlavi. And it's structured with 21 Nasks, which perhaps means something like a bundle, and which are correlated and keyed to the 21 words of the Yatha Ahuvario or the Ahunavairya prayer. So for the Zoroastrians in the room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If there is a prayer you would have memorized, it would be that one. And then we come to Dēnkard 9. And Dēnkard 9 has 3 commentaries on what we would call the Old Avesta in, let's say, Etic terms. And it's worth saying right off the bat that the 3 commentaries are not at all the same. They almost never have the same analysis of the original Avestan Gothic passage that they are nominally commenting on. And then this was actually what I found so interesting about the project. And so I'll come to that in a second. So let's get to the gestation of this project. You're right, with a lot of these long-term projects, you have unreliable narrators telling you about how they came to be. And in my case, the project sort of began in 2000, 2003, 2004 for my doctoral dissertation at Harvard, as Rahim has said. And you can see the people who actually were on the committee, including a very well-known name here. But there is some irony for me in this, because sitting right opposite him is Stephanie Jamison, who was my Sanskrit teacher, and my initial idea, my initial project, which I started my dissertation on, was a kind of comparative ritual analysis. I wanted to look at the yasna and the vispered and think about it sort of Zoroastrian ritual in comparison with Vedic. Well, Stephanie landed up here, and that project was no longer viable, so I landed up with this project. And it's quite interesting, because after all these years, people say, oh, this project, it's like it just fits you. Well, the honest truth is that it's a bit, it's arbitrary. It's a funny thing. Shervo kept telling me, the project you want to do cannot be done. And I said, why? He says, well, the problem is that you need to sort of completely understand the yasna and completely understand the vispered and completely understand the videvdat, and no one can do this project in one lifetime. So, okay, fine. Reasonable enough. And I bought it. And I have to say, and I want to make this point, it's very important for me to say this, that my admiration for Dr. Shervo is only matched by my gratitude. He was the most caring of supervisors. He was not the most easy person when we made mistakes, but he always wanted us to get better. And I think that was something that he held us to a really high standard. And now, all these years later, teaching students and seeing other people who were produced by people who didn't hold people to the same standard, I have really, my admiration for him grows just every single day. And it's just something that I feel incredibly grateful to be able to stand here and say this. And UCLA is a nice place for me to do this because in 2007, I actually had my defense at UCLA because we were all here for a conference that Rahim threw on the Iranian world and the Talmud. And so, giving you this part of it, the story, I would just like to kind of continue by saying that the original work was what we would basically say the first volume. It was the critical edition and some interpretive essays, which I then developed into a variety of different articles. And then the second volume, the commentary, was written all the years afterwards. And it's one of these interesting problems when you in modern academia. Normally, if you do something like this is career suicide because you don't have any production. And when it finally comes out, it's a text edition, and that's the last thing anyone wants to see. But I have to say that I, rightly or wrongly, I just knew that this project deserved its time. And I tried to make sure that I worked on every bit of it as I could. And once again, I should say this, because towards the end, during pandemic, when we were all stuck at home, I finally sort of was getting close to finishing. And Octor was so incredibly generous. He read the whole thing again, for the, 1,000th time. And it was incredibly meaningful to me because it was the ability for me to also see the problematic things early that had essentially been resolved over all the years, so I hope. So let me just say a little bit about the actual text. The text itself, the original text, is about 6,600 words. The two volumes, I think, are 240,000 something words. And it's just a classic example when civilians say, why do you guys write so much stuff? But that's what it needed, and that's what it has received. And we're looking at basically 31 manuscript pages in the B manuscript. So this is not, in a sense, a gigantic text. So the question is, why does it have such a voluminous project behind it? And that's what I'm going to try and just tease out in the next few minutes. So let me begin with all these projects. I think it's really, really important, and especially with graduate students here, that every dissertation sort of has to engage with the scholarship of the past, as we always do in anything we write now. So let me just do a very brief survey of what had been done before. So I think it's important because none of us do things, from scratch in that sense. So Edward William West, the first translator, he worked on this in the 19th century, published it in 1892, and he has this really nice quote. He says, "The 8th and 9th books also contain very few of those involved sentences with long parenthetical clauses, which, owing to the habitual absence or misplacement of stops, are very perplexing to a translator. The chief difficulties of the text arise from its synoptical character and the consequent want of connection between its sentences, there being often too little context to define the meaning of a doubtful word." This is 100% accurate, and this problem will never go away, because that's, in a sense, what the kind of the literary character of the text. But then it also tells us the purpose of the Sūdgar was apparently, as its name imports, to extract useful instruction from the text and to illustrate it with legends and remarks. So, obviously, as I started working on this project, I was my initial idea, and with Octor, was to actually do all three of them. And so, have 17 years in, so one's down, and we got a little bit more time. If I work quickly, you never know. But after West, Madan, the Parsi priest, he was charged by the Parsi Panchayat with actually recopying and printing the famous B manuscript, which is in the Kama Oriental Institute in Mumbai. And he says, "The part which was assigned to me in the publication of this work was not that of an editor. My instructions were most scrupulously to publish a copy and an exact copy of the manuscript B. I have therefore not amended even patent mistakes in the manuscript wherever they occurred." And this is true, but only up to a point. Because one thing that Madan did is that he spaces the words, as opposed to them all being jammed together. And Bartolome and others actually quite critiqued him and said, oh, he's misparsed them, but I don't find that to be the case. I think for the most part, he has done, it's very helpful. And that's essentially what every one of us worked on when we worked on the material prior to whatever critical edition that was eventually constructed for a particular Dēnkard book. So even though the B manuscript was published by Dresden in the 60s, people you will see in the old literature still keep citing modern because it was just easier to read. And that also has some limitations. So, and then we have two Parsi priests, father and son, who published the entire Dēnkard in 19 volumes between 1874 and 1928. And the Sanjanas tell us, the Sūdgar Nask, the first Nask treated in Book 9, was devoted to elucidating important points from the Avesta text of the various Has, of the Gathas, with suggestive remarks and allusions to the history and legend prevailing in ancient Iran. Once again, it's relatively similar to what we see West having said. And then in the 60s, Ahmed Tafazoli, one of the great Iranian scholars of the 20th century, he wrote his dissertation on the Sūdgar Nask and the Vasht Mansar Nask. The bag was just too big. So he was a little bit more ambitious than me. He got 2 out of the 3. And he tells us, he sort of divides the text into sort of 3 parts in its relationship with the Avestan material. He says, there are excerpts whose equivalents can be found in the Avestan texts, parts that have the characteristics of living Avestan, but we do not have equivalents to them, but similar ones can be found in the Avestan texts, parts that we do not have Avestan or Zan texts or the like, but in terms of style, we can be sure that these parts are taken from Avestan texts, and their origin is simply not available to us now. So he tries to create a typology of what material would have been the Avestan input into these things. And Tafazoli essentially says that the text is basically, this Nask has 2 types. So it has 2 basic things happening in the content. Religious rules and moral content related to good and bad deeds and enumerating their results, and religious fables and myths, which funnily enough sounds like basically any Pahlavi text you could imagine. So in a sense, what I've shown you is more or less some of the most important things that people have actually said about the text as a sort of secondary analytical analysis. Don Shapiro wrote his dissertation on the Zand, and he wrote quite a bit about Dēnkard 9, but not exclusively about Dēnkard 9, but other texts as well. And he says the Zand of the Vasht Mansar, the second one, is so to speak a philological one, while the Sūdgar Nask is of a rather associative and midrashic character. And I do agree with this. I think that's something that has really informed my work, that the study of midrash has been very, very helpful for being able to create a theory of textuality, of reading this type of associative material. But he goes on to say in another article that, as in other cases, it is the Vasht Mansar version rather than that of the just quoted Sūdgar that preserves the older material, while that of the Sūdgar Nask underwent serious censorship. The reason for this censorship was that, being originally of mythological character, the Sūdgar Nask was entitled to be more popular, thus opening the way to introducing newer and not unfrequently heterodoxical material. And I don't believe one word in this. I think this is just misguided in every aspect. The entire principle of what it's built on it runs sort of counter to what I have tried to show. So you can be the judge of it. But let me take a step back and just say a little bit about these 21 Nasks. So we have Dēnkard 8 tells us that there were 21 Nasks that had once existed with their Pahlavi Zands. That would mean that if you believe this, and there's decent enough reason to believe it, you would have had theoretically 42 Avestan and Pahlavi texts that would have represented something like a canon of the Zoroastrian literature that existed in sometime in late antiquity. Dēnkard 8 itself tells us that some of these materials, some of these Nasks, the Pahlavi is just lost. It was lost even for them, and some the Avestan was just lost for them. To put it in perspective, and this is an important thing, and the specialists in the room has probably heard this 100 times, but it's worth saying that of these 21, the Videvdad is the only one that has a virtually complete Avestan and a virtually complete Pahlavi. The Pahlavi does have some 1 or 2 strophes and some sections missing that just don't survive. But basically, it's the one intact one. So it's worth saying that we have the names of these texts, And many of these lost texts, their names themselves are rather hard to etymologize. They represent a kind of a larger meta-textual world that existed once in, let's call it, sort of pre-late antique times. And it seems to me that, to put it in sort of Sanskrit terms, this would be much like the stage of Brahmana literature that we have that basically elucidates the earlier material, which is just sort of missing in Avesta. We have a little bit of explicit hermeneutical material in Avesta in Yasna 19, 20, and 21, but that's a tiny fraction of what had to have existed, because you just cannot have a living oral tradition that has one stage and then 2,000 years later you start to have a different language. It just doesn't make sense. It cannot work that way. And I think that's sort of, and we'll come back to the question of orality. So what is interesting is that they're divided in sort of three sections. We have the first seven are the Gothic Nask, Gahanik. The next are the Hada Mansrik, that is with mantras, let's say, or mantras. And then the last seven are the Dadik, or the legal Nasks. So Dēnkard 9 basically gives us 3 Pahlavi resumes of lost Pahlavi commentaries, which are putative translations of young Avestan commentaries on the Old Avesta. Okay? So essentially, stage 1 survives and stage 4 survives. And we have to sort of reconstitute the thing in the middle in order to try to make sense of what we're looking at. Whether one's done that successfully, the reviewers will say. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quick passages from Dēnkard 8 that actually talk about this. They're quite detailed, and I don't want to get into that. But one of the things that we are told is that since the 3 Gas of the Ahunvar, the 3 verse lines, which are the foundation of the enumeration of the tradition, Dēn Oshmorishan, are an example of the 3 divisions of the enumeration of the tradition, and thus it shows that these 3 divisions are the 3 parts of what are the 21 words, that is the Ahunavarya, as it is evident that the omniscient creator, Vispagadadar, himself fashioned one utterance, what I think is a nask, from each single word, that is each single word of the Ahunavarya. So essentially, the entire taxonomic system of Zoroastrian textuality in late antiquity is key to the Yatha al-Vario prayer. And the fact of that is not highly shocking, because we can already see many, many traces of its importance and its hermeneutical dynamism in young Avestan already. So for the Parsis in the room, Zoroastrians in the room, what you can clearly see is that when you pray it, it is something that goes right back to the origins of Zoroastrianism. And I think that's not there are many debatable things, but this is not one of them. So the text also goes on to talk about how it was constituted because of the chaos that came with the death of Alexander and presumably the Diadochoi and the rule, and then sort of the dividing of his empire and such. And it says that it was not so much possible to recover as what could be considered authoritative. Now, how the transmission process is the salvage philology, as I sometimes call it, of the ancient Zoroastrians is not exactly well understood. But we have quite a bit of Zoroastrian Pahlavi literature that essentially meditates on precisely how Zoroastrian literature has come down to us. And that's what a lot of my Paris lectures are about. It's interesting that they have no problem explaining the loss and damage that has taken place in its tradition. They don't try to hide the loss. They, in fact, really engage with this problem. So I think that's quite interesting, because you don't see this in every place. And it's also worth saying that when we talk about these texts, they say things like, so for within these indestructible and fitting chronicles, any pain, dard, and any difficulty, drushtag, is explained. Vizari. So they also have built into the sort of the paratextual material for the Dēnkard a claim about how social difficulties are a very fundamental constitutive part of how knowledge was transmitted and received. And I think that's quite important, because the social material and the inherited material from the Avestan often create a sort of tension. I threw a workshop on the Dēnkard with Samra Zarnush in October, and it was amazing that those who worked on the Dēnkard late antique side just saw the late antique value on the Islamic side of the project, and those who worked on the Avestan side saw the Avestan side. And it's just a classic example that, our personal scholarly hermeneutics determines what we think is constitutive of the material that we read. So let me jump ahead a little bit. We have a wonderful, wonderful single example of the reference to these Nasks and this large, gigantic body of lost literature in early modern India. And Henry Lord, chaplain of the East India Company, says about the Parsis in Surat in Gujarat in 1630. They affirm then that this book contained in it 3 several tracts, the first whereof treated of that which we call judicial astrology, foretelling the events of things to come, by judgment of the stars, which by them is called Astudega. And then he goes on to explain the various other ones. But it's quite interesting that he actually tells us the name of the Sūdgar. And it's worth saying that in the Zoroastrian literature, for the most part, in the Dēnkard, it's called Sūdgar, whereas in other texts, like in Carlos Zandi Vachmaniasen, it's called Stūdgar. So we get 2 forms. The Stud form clearly has to do with the trade. They've etymologized it as meaning praise, and the Sud has to do with profit or benefit. So it's quite amazing to see that this gigantic, we have references to this large body of work that no longer quite exists, but was still known to Parsis in the 17th century, and also then being referenced by people like Lord. So, just a little bit about the way the text is structured. The way the Dēnkard 9 operates is that it's divided along the traditional heities of the Old Avesta, the traditional divisions, but they're called fragads in the text. So the fragad about so-and-so heighty. And they do you have the entire Young Avesta, the entire Old Avestan sequence in the Sūdgar, and then they do the whole thing again in the Vashmansar, and then the whole thing again in the back. So you can take any heighty of the Old Avesta, and you can read 3 commentaries on it, and they will be completely different. Meaning the content of what they are actually interpreting, the original Avestan content, let's say, is not necessarily dealt with in the same way. Which is quite an important point, and this is what actually attracted me to this project when Octa first suggested it to me. It means that the notion that we have of fixity of meaning of a single text is not something that bothered them. They were able to hold a capacious notion that the sacred literature could have multiple different meanings at different, let's say, philosophical registers. Some of them are more ritual-based, some of them are more focused on mytho-epic, some are more didactic. And in a sense, all 3 of them have their own unique style, but they all have elements of the others in them. So, it's worth saying that the Sūdgar is clearly the most allegorizing. And that, I think, is, in a sense, worth also pointing out with regard to my project, which is that because the modern critical edition now happens to be mine, people will have a natural tendency of over-reading the value of the Sūdgar as a proxy for Zoroastrian hermeneutics. Whereas if I had done one of the other ones, it would have gone in a slightly different direction. So it's interesting that, for example, the Indo-Europeanists and those who work on Avestan, when they're trying to work out Avestan philology, find the Vashmansar much more interesting because it is something that operates more closely connected with the way that they understand Avestan, rather than a very highly allegorizing, highly eisegetical text that we have with the Sūdgar. So I want to do a couple more things. So one of the things that this project did as well was establish a stemma for the texts. So I've just given it to you in a little bit, and you can see it from its earliest moment all the way through down. So our earliest colophon is 1020, and our latest manuscript is 1868. And that is actually copied, interestingly enough, in Mumbai. So it's worth saying that there are basically, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's a little bit with the colophons of the two main manuscripts, but I'll come to that in a second. The main B manuscript is the one that has the old 1020 colophon, but we also have Codex DH. And DH is what is the manuscript that the other earlier scholars did not have access to. So, for example, when West did his edition, he used the manuscript K43 from Copenhagen, which is a clear copy of DH, no doubt about it, but it has many mistakes that DH doesn't have. So I think one thing that my project has done, what my work has done, is that it has foregrounded DH in a way that had never been quite done before. Most of everything else had been built of a Madan, which is basically the B manuscript copied into a printed form. They are very close in parts, but there are differences. And there are particular moments where you suddenly realize that they seem to have a different text. It happens a few times, and there's no explaining it in any obviously easy way. So these are these great things where we can see that they go back to a common original, and then at times suddenly one has some marginal note, or it has some extra words, a half extra line. It's a bit strange. And this is one of the things that I've reflected on a lot, and in terms of also why does Pahlavi literature come down to us in the messy form that it does. Much has been written about how Avestan literature is sort of, so to speak, messy vis-a-vis, let's say, the transmission that we have for Vedic. But we also have to kind of create a transmission narrative for how this happens with Pahlavi. And for example, and also in terms of the copying of the actual manuscripts. And I'm somewhat taken with this idea, which I never said quite in print, I don't think, maybe I did it, is that maybe some of these manuscripts were read out by one priest and copied by the other. Because there's sometimes oral mistakes that just don't look like written mistakes. They look like someone heard it wrong. You know, a classic example would be having noun plus esofe, as opposed to, and they hear abstract noun. So instead of mad-e, they hear mad-di. That's just an oral mistake. You're never going, it cannot graphically be made. We have some examples like that. So these are the kind of things that I've thought about some. And this is something that I think would be, that hopefully in the years to come, we'll be able to do more with this side of the project. That is the actual lived transmission of these texts. So I'll just do very briefly with the colophon. The colophon of the B manuscript says that it was preserved in Iraq, in Asuristan, and it says that it was preserved in Baghdad. And basically it talks about 5 or 6 generations of interpreters earlier. And the text also goes on to basically make this point that it goes back to Adul-Bad, son of Maraspan, which is a very common sort of a statement that he's one of the great sages of the sort of early Sasanian times. And it basically says that, there's a link that ties these transmitters from Zarathustra all the way to end times. And it also, for sort of the passage just ends, and I make the point, it talks about the complete reward in the endless lights of perpetual benefit, Hameshag Sood. And there we have this Sood word. And my Paris lectures sort of focus specifically on this word and where it shows up in Pahlavi literature, and it is just all over the place in a variety of eschatological and quasi-eschatological ways. So the question is, what does Sūdgar actually mean? It means something like the profit maker, the benefit maker, and it has built into it some implicit notion of eschatology, which is clearly what they do insofar as that the origins of the beginnings of the Old Avestan corpus are clearly seen cosmogonically, and the end of the Old Avestan corpus, the ritual, if you will, is seen as eschatology. So the text encodes the kind of teleology of the world. And this is not something that I came up with. This is something that people like Darmstädter and others had seen. Molay wrote about it in great detail. Octor has written about it in great detail. But it is very interesting that you can clearly see that being played out in this material as well. And the DH colophon is from 1577 in Kerman. And in that sense, it's the earliest attested actual manuscript that we have. And it has all sorts of interesting things, because we see them basically talking about the idea that they want to have their sins expiated, and that this is written for their children and their kin 150 years henceforth. And this is something that we see very much as part of the kind of style of Pahlavi colophons. And what is quite interesting is he says at the end, he wrote in it the Jamaspan, the Vishtas Sast, and a Nask. And that's the other interesting thing, like what is this reference to? So there are some mysteries in terms of the transmission that are not at this stage quite resolvable unless we find some new material. But he also says, may it be put to use to, and I put the word promote, Iranianness, eri, goodness and belonging to the good tradition. And so built into the transmission and the preservation of this material is a notion that they're trying to preserve eri, Iranianness. And it's worth saying that in Pahlavi literature, we have legal literature that basically says that when certain people have apostatized and become Muslims, they lose their eri, which is interesting because most of us in a kind of contemporary modern world would say they changed their religious identity, but what we would call their kind of ethnic identity, their Iranianness, just would remain. But in fact, for the Zoroastrians, eri, Iranianness, is essentially isomorphic with Zoroastrianness. And I think this is also something there's a lot of material that can be done with this, sort of exploring this question in greater detail. Touraj Daryoi and several others have written about it, and it kind of goes back to the whole question of Iran Shah and what that means. But here we see that in the colophons actually sometimes give us a really nice little glimpse as to how they understood their moment in their link in the chain of the greater transmission of this highly sacred literature that meant something to them. So, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. It's not worth sort of mentioning too much about the manuscripts, but if you just look, for example, at this chart, you can see that DH is complete, K43B is complete. Look at B, there's almost nothing. So, for the Sūdgar, the B manuscript is basically not really operationalized. You have all these secondary manuscripts, J5, MR, which are copies of B. So we have tertiary copies of the B manuscript, but not the actual B manuscript for the Sūdgar. For the other Nasks, it's not a problem. So that's the other thing. So the DH, for example, trails off at the last part in the bag. So there's not a single old manuscript that exists for all three Nasks from like the first bit to the end bit. And that also makes it a bit challenging in terms of constituting the text. So what do we see here? For me, the best readings of the manuscript, and this is an eclectic edition, but what I basically did is that I used the DH and the copies of B to reconstruct. And essentially what we can see very, very clearly is that DH brings to us many, many readings that are not in the other editions and the way people have read before because they didn't have access to it. And this goes all the way through Shapira and also the popular translation of Rahamasha in 2009 and such. So I think it makes my critical edition a little bit different than what had been done in earlier scholarship. So what is the hermeneutic challenge of studying the Zand more generally, right? Lawrence Hayworth Mills was the first scholar of Avestan in the English-speaking world, and he was the extraordinary professor of Zend at Oxford. And he's gotten a lot of bad press over the years because we find his work to be quite a very outdated and really kind of relatively naive vis-a-vis Avestan, and he gets very bad press vis-a-vis his German contemporaries for Avestan studies. And I would agree with that. But when it comes to Pahlavi, I think people completely misunderstood what he was trying to do. And he tells us, but in the Gatha commentaries, context often gives us no aid at all. accuracy may be wholly wanting in one place where the most valuable results await us at the next word. As a consequence, many of us, unconsciously, clubbed together to keep up our appearances while we ignored or unintentionally misrepresented the whole subject. And one of the least critical remarks that we have ever made was that the translations of the Gathas depend upon a crude application of etymology without any report of the actual sense. And then he goes on to say, so the translations are often richest for research where they are the worst as mere renderings, that is, renderings of the original Avestan. What we need the most is not even their vast body of correct root etymology, so dear to a beginner. The thing for a true constructor is the seeming heap rubbish out of which glints here and there the gold of discoveries. And in a sense, I found this quote many years after I had actually worked on the project, but in a sense, he's a patron saint of this project because he's able to see something that I've essentially argued for. The problem with the way that Zoroastrian commentary literature has been studied is that virtually anyone who can work in it technically has historically been trained as some type of linguist or philologist. And the problem is for good linguistics, good philology, you have to have root etymological analysis as your constraint. But the problem is when you have a text which doesn't care about root etymological analysis and is essentially doing intentional violation of the original material for allegorizing purposes, the linguistic side just doesn't really have much to offer. So what ends up happening is you keep trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, or you essentially say, there's such a long period of time between the original Avestan and Pahlavi that they didn't understand, and this is just a simple loss of competency, allowing them to do this eisegesis willy-nilly. And I just never found that credible, because that's not how living traditions operate, especially not oral ones that need multi-generational transmission to have any coherence. Dr. Sherwood, many years ago, we had many discussions about this, but he made a very important point to me once when he said, if you have an oral tradition, you have to have oral zans. Otherwise, by the time you get to the Pahlavi, the Pahlavi speakers cannot understand the case-based Avestan language. What they would have produced would have been completely nonsensical. And in fact, they get many things, quote unquote, correct from the perspective of how we think of the original semantics of the Avestan. Obviously, there are limits that they cannot do. They don't have verbal categories that we had in Avestan. They don't have cases, so they can't do certain things, which they have to do with prepositional phrases. So there are limits to what they could do. But we see this again and again, that they're able to do certain things. So for example, you have an Avestan form that, let's say, is progenitor. They translate as ancestor. It's a different root, but it has the same semantics. And that's the most direct evidence that the indigenous transmission has a real understanding of something that goes back to the origins of Zoroastrianism. Not in every case, and if you sort of did this word by word through the Gathas, you may get you get a mixed bag. And in a sense, that is what Mills was referring to. But the Sūdgar is offering us a different way of reading sacred literature. And that requires a different theory of reading. So, having said that, it's worth saying that everything we say in early Iranian studies is essentially has to navigate this problem of orality. So, Dēnkard 9 exhibits, from my perspective, all the diagnostic features commonly recognized as characteristic of oral modes of transmission, as well as a more free word order, which strongly suggests in cases that we're looking at Pahlavi renderings of lost Avesta. They're violating subject-object verb groups all over the place. We have ring compositions, that's the structuring of narrative and formulaic elements in chiastic patterns, the use of symbolic numbers to organize data, 3, 7, 21, good thoughts, words and deeds, Amesha Spentas, 21 Nasks, 3 by 7 happens to be 21, that's not coincidental. recurrent phrases. So the text always, the way that the Sūdgar operates, it says abar, about, and then it dilates on something. And then when it wants to switch and move to something else, it will say udeni and this too. And then they will shift. So we have 78 attestations of abar and 51 of udeni. I went back and calculated and counted all these up. Formulaic language, a very paratactic and enumerative style, and also a very interesting thing, a gigantic number of nominal sentences and verbal nouns in ishin, ishni, instead of the finite verbs you might expect. And I suspect, I was telling this to Rahim, I suspect, from my perspective, this is because at some point they were finding it challenging to work out some of the verbal system of the Avesta. And by putting them into this form, they essentially had undo the how do I put it? The various verbal, the range of verbal choices that they had. And this essentially just treats them almost like the verb as a cover term. Almost something quasi sort of akin to what you might expect them to have done with like aromeograms or something, where they just represent, it's just almost like you did it like a Chinese symbol, so to speak. So how should we think about commentary as a rhetorical form? So Aaron Hughes in Islamic Studies has a very, very nice piece on this, and I really like the way he thinks about it. He says, commentary is an attempt at retrieval. It is a form of activity that seeks to retrieve a past, and in so doing, unlock the contemporary landscape. By situating itself interstitially between past and present, familiarity and unfamiliarity, it attempts to belong to both worlds. In so doing, it retrieves, often selectively, those elements of the past that will be most useful to the contemporary discussion. Commentaries revalorize a discourse that took place in the past in order to emphasize the social, moral, and authentic continuity between then and now. And I would put this in very basic terms, that from members of living communities, what do people really want with regard to the past? It's people need and want a usable past. So the thing is, when they have this deep, ancient, quite mysterious Avestan past, and they're trying to make sense of it in their late antique moment, what are they able to do with it? So we can see some interesting things with the Sūdgar Nask, and there's some very striking hermeneutic tendencies that it has. So many of its interpretations appear to be specific interpretations of the titles or incipits of the traditional divisions of the Old Avesta, Yata Ahuvairyo, or let's say the Vohu Shatra Gatha or the Vahishtoishti Gatha, which they then dilate upon these using highly elusive intertextual narratives that in some cases appear to never return to the Old Avestan base text. So they take something in the Old Avesta and then they start a hermeneutic narrative that never comes back to the Old Avesta at all. And the fragments of the Sūdgar Nask are especially challenging to analyze given that they are very associative in style. They have mytho-epic contents, expansive narratives, and they harmonize seemingly unrelated Avestan and Pahlavi sources. So you have the mytho-epic material that we find in the Yashts and in Pahlavi literature read into the Gathas, where if you read the original in the Gathas, you're like, none of these figures are there. Why the hell are these guys there? And they have various ways of doing this, of constituting a commentarial system that essentially creates a much larger meta-textual world, or so I would argue. So there are some various themes and motifs in the text, and I don't want to get too fixated on it, but one of the things we see is that we have what I call hermeneutic triggers for each fragment. So, for example, in the Vohu Shatra Gatha, Vohu Shatra etymologically will mean good rule, and what do? They then tell us a narrative about the evil rule of Ajidahaka. And they do this quite consistently, where they same with the Vahishtoishti, the best seeking. And they interpret this way, and they say, and the best seeking, and they do the negative version of this, which is Kaus, seeking the heavens, and his hubris of trying to basically achieve heaven and then falling back to earth. So they take these mytho-epic stories that we have, which exist in Avestan, and then they read it back, so to say, they eisegetically read it into the Old Avestan material, which doesn't in fact on the surface have anything to do with these things. So this is often what was so puzzling to the earlier scholars, because they were like, this is just a grab bag of random things that show up. And I don't feel they're random at all, that there are actually processes here, hermeneutical processes. And the trick is you have to work out the hermeneutical trigger, that's something in the original that lets them do what they have done in whatever the content. And then afterwards, they do it again, where they switch categories, they switch topics. And trying to work it out is a little bit like, I was saying this to Rahim, and he's like, don't tell me this, but it's like listening to like rap, where in a sense, the rapper has a world of discourse that they know. You listen to it, but if you don't know the reference, you lose the thread very quickly. If you know it, you can follow it. So this is sort of, and built into this is basically what I would say is tradition building. They draw from the entire tradition and read the entire tradition into the Gathas. Why would they do this? Because the Old Avesta represents, encoded in it, the entire history of the world to come. And we see this quite clearly, that they do this in a more mini scale with even the Yathaoverio prayer, where it sort of encodes the entire world to come. This is again something that we do see variants of this and aspects of this type of thinking built into, say, Vedic literature. This is not something that's unique to the Iranians by any means. And so we also find Andar statements. We have a lot of wisdom literature put in there, and you have to kind of work out why they've done that. A lot of eschatological references. We have references to adhering to the law in the correct way. We have references to the great cardinal values of Zoroastrianism like charity, radi. We have the importance of priests, and this is something very near and dear to my heart, that the priests are always basically asking for remuneration because they're the poor ones. And then we also have this very interesting categories connected with the inescapability of death and sort of this trope of vanitas and about the relationship between the body and the soul, which we see a lot in late antique literature. And they've read all these various tropes into the material. So I'll just, they also talk about the importance of reciting the Gathas. So for example, they say, and how the one who in a Mazdian village after 15 years of age had not recited the Gathas was in sinfulness like a dog being thrown a piece of meat. And about the Gathas in that world being clothed in wool from that world, which is adorned with every kind of marvel, being like the righteous one who recites the Gathas. So it's worth saying that we have all these various tropes and categories floating around in this material, and trying to make sense of it is quite challenging. So what can we say about this? And I'm very much of the view that what we're seeing in the Sūdgar Nask and the Nasks in general is a form of correlative thought. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you an example. In fact, I just put this in a couple hours before. I had not planned to give a precise example, but I thought, someone might like to see some actual action rather than me just babbling on. So in the Atta Vakshya Haiti, I'm sorry, the diacritics have gone a little bit screwy. In Old Avestan, in Yasna 30, it says, "Thus I shall speak, O you who wish to come, those words which even a knowing man should pay attention to. The praises and ritual performances of my good thought performed for the Ahura. O well-attentive ones, and for order or truth, Asha, on account of for which through the lights gladdening things are being seen." It's a very typical Old Avestan phrase, strophe, which is to try to work out what does it actually mean, what's it referring to, in which moment in time. Now, the Pahlavi does something very interesting. It says, "Thus both utterances are to be sought which Ormazd established, that is, the Avesta and Zand." So they have created the objectified Avesta as we understand it. Also, the one who is aware, that is knowledgeable, should do priestly studies. So there you have a reference to the priests and the Hermeneuticsin, that's the priestly school. That from which the praise of Ormazd and the sacrifice to good thought is manifest, that is the Avesta and Zand. The one who thinks good thoughts, humanida, through righteousness, achloi, as well as the one who thinks things which are honest, that is his or her good deeds, and sacrifice will be greater. Those in the lights, and the roshni, who experience joy by seeing, that is when the divine ones see the sacrifice in the mental realm or in the realm of thought, then they will experience pleasure. This is quite interesting. So they have created a slightly different reading of what this original passage would have meant from the Avestan. Not that we necessarily completely understand the Avestan. So what does the Sūdgar do with this? Sūdgar, the sixth fragad, the Attavakshya, is about the fact that 5 prosperities, Panjabadi, are the best. The first comes about by means of righteousness, Pahlavi, and the second by a good child, Frazandinek, and the third by land which is full of growth, Zamigi Roishanamand, and the fourth by a flock of sheep, Ramagi Meshan, and the fifth by having been instructed in doing one's duty, Khweshkari. I'm sorry, all the diacritics have gotten a bit funny. And then the text goes on to say, Abad, Bakshishini o Tukshagan, Khwara, Ud o Ashgehanan, Shkohi, about how fortune, Khwara, that's a Khwarna we know from Avestan, is distributed to the diligent and poverty to the indolent. So, how does this relate to what comes before in the Pahlavi Yasna or of the Pahlavi translation of the Gathas? It's difficult to see. And for me, it's not simply the question of just motivating the trigger into the original base text, but also motivating the narratologic, the hermeneutical narratology of the commentary itself. How do you get from these 5 prosperities, these 5 good things, and then next thing you know, you're talking about fortune being distributed to the good and, poverty to the bad? What's the connection between strophe 1 and the sentence 1 and sentence 2? This is the constant problem of this text. And here is where I found something which I think is really, really cool. And it's one of the things I think is just so interesting in the study of Pahlavi literature. So, in Dēnkard 3, we have a text that tells us about the opinion or conviction regarding the Arang, the Jaxartes river, Avestan Rangha, and the Weh, the Oxus river, Pahlavi Weh Daiti, for Pahlavi Weh Daiti, or Avestan Vanguhi Daitia, from the Exposition of Good Tradition. It says, namely, and I supply some words to be fair, Arang in Avestan is the formula Afson, Rangi, and its Zand is Rai, that is Avestan Raiwant, munificent. And the word explicating it in the Zand is Tukshagi, diligence. And Weh in Avestan is Vanghi, good, and its Zand is Abadi, prosperity. It is called Khwara as well. The Khwara is the same as Khweshkari, duty, literally one's own work, since Tukshagi and Khweshkari go together. And Rai and Tukshagi are instruments, abzar, of immortality, Amargi, whose abode in creation is called Arang by the Creator. And Khwara and Khweshkari are instruments of all forms of satisfaction, whose abode in creation is called Weh. And Khwara and Khweshkari are revealed in it, that is presumably the Dane, by him, presumably Ormazd. So what they show us here is the native indigenous semantic system that correlates words and concepts that are not necessarily etymologically connected, but create something like a world that allows us to see that when you go back to this passage, all of a sudden you see Khweshkari at the end of line 1, and then the next one is about Khwara. So in fact, there is this sort of, if you want to call it mysticism, but I prefer to think of this as actually correlative thought. They have a way of linking the entire world together. And this is very much akin to the kind of things that we see in Vedic literature with the Bandhu system, which I have written about before as well. And this is something I think is so interesting because this allows us, and this example is good because it actually works for this particular passage. And this sort of tells us that the heterogeneous grab bag nature of these commentaries are actually not that necessarily heterogeneous. The old scholars who suggested that just people dump things together is not what's happening. They are making all these quasi-etymological or sort of folk etymological connections between things, between various disparate realms of society and the way they understand the world. And this allows the texts to look random, but are in fact, from their perspective, completely correlated with each other. This is quite cool. Now, I've only found one of these, because you don't see, this is just not something that Pahlavi does. But this one little example, if you actually look at it closely, it has the Avestan, it has the Pahlavi gloss of it, and then it gives you the kind of actual meaning of what that Pahlavi gloss could have meant in a different context. So we can see that they are able to operationalize all these ideas in different ways. And I think this is something to me that really challenges the kind of old-fashioned idea that this is sort of naive hermeneutics. There's nothing naive going on with these guys. It's just that we are not able to sort of work out what they've been doing. So very briefly, and I'll close it because I've gone quite a long time. My theory of reading the hermeneutics of the Sūdgar Nask, I would suggest that Dēnkard 9 is a composite text with a mosaic structure, a concatenation of seemingly random sections containing dozens of non sequiturs from other texts, representing the hermeneutics of a foundational text, the Old Avesta, with the only reference to its base text being the name of the fragad, the incipit of the Old Avestan text or haiti in question. Similarly, the co-texts, the ones that look the same from other sources, are never explicitly referenced either and are made into intertexts incorporated within the narratology of each fragad. So you may find the same passage in Sūdgar Nask is in the Bundahishin, or it's in Ardaviraz, or it's anywhere. Reading this text is therefore a fundamentally intertextual exercise of recognizing the relational nature of both meaning and significance by moving between texts and across genres, activating nodes in a web or network of textual and meta-textual relations, thus establishing new forms of allegoresis, which I believe are ultimately grounded in an inherited form of homological or correlative thought that they've actually got from Avestan at some deep level. I term this entire hermeneutical complex as traditional intersignification, the warp and weft of weaving a new text composed of implicit proof text and explicit commentary, thus renewing, making, and ultimately extending tradition in both its chronotopic, that is time and space, and diatopic, geographical dimensions. So in this sense, traditional hermeneutes, or interpreters of the tradition, the Dane, and their interpretations are not outside the text, but within it. This is analogous to the fact that each of us attempts to understand, delimit, and interpret the world we inhabit and develop our Weltanschauung or worldview, forming our personal hermeneutics while in dialogical relationships with ourselves, the subjective, the world, the objective, and others, the intersubjective senses. So while simultaneously living within it, that is the world. This is especially so in the case of traditions like pre-modern Zoroastrianism, where sacred knowledge passed orally from teacher to student, and hence was literally embodied within the hermeneute or tradent, namely the priest or the sage. So, since all reading is premised on presuppositions, I've always operated with the assumption that the implied reader of the text, as redacted, was a man, a member of the inherited priesthood, well-versed in his tradition, and living in the Iranian world in the early Islamic era. That is for the text as we have it redacted for us. As such, he would embody all the hermeneutical and cultural predispositions for our text to exercise the maximal theological effects upon him. Predispositions, I might add, that were internalized in a dialectical relationship with the hermeneutic community organized around a foundational and authoritative text, that is the Old Avesta, in an intersubjective relationship with his fellow hermeneutes and their corresponding interpretive practices and relative social prestige. The text, in turn, assumes this implied reader or tradent lives tradition and transmits it across the generations, a Dane Burdar, or bearer of the tradition, so to speak, and hence its elliptical style. They're talking to people who already know the texts. In doing so, the reading or hermeneutic process transforms the text and its hermeneutes, tradents, redactors, scribes, and ultimately its contemporary readers, it's us, scholarly and communal alike. So we must also recognize that the social purpose of redaction was not to produce a text devoid of contradictions or even controversy, but rather one that reveals and acknowledges the second-order nature of the redactor's temporality and positionality vis-a-vis their foundational texts, 2,000 years after they were composed. I mean, we know it to be 2,000 years. How they thought about it's a different story, of course. And so ultimately, hermeneutics, following Heidegger, is both the mode of inquiry and the subject of inquiry. Hence, hermeneutics can be pithily defined as understanding understanding. And in doing so, hermeneutics transforms both text and reader. And in the case of Dēnkard Book 9, the text and the commentary are correlative. So, to make a long story short, I will end with just this little quote, which I quite like. So, Steven Weinberg, a Nobel laureate in physics, said, "A physicist friend of mine once said that in facing death, he drew some consolation from the reflection that he would never again have to look up the word hermeneutics in the dictionary." Thank you.